Stop the world!
Escalation is not something we should necessarily be scared of in terms of any actions the collective West takes in response to Putin's rhetoric or war of choice.
Welcome to Stop the World, the ASPI podcast on security and international affairs. I'm Olivia Nelson.
And I'm David Rowe.
This week, we're bringing you the second episode of our short series recorded on the sidelines of ASPI's annual Defence Conference earlier this month. Today, it's all about Russia, North Korea, China, and nuclear threats.
I'm going to name it Authoritarian Thursday. First up, Alex Bristow speaks to former Australian diplomat and defence official Peter Tesch and Dr. B. Yun Jo, Associate Research Fellow at the Centre for Security and Strategy at the Korea Institute for Defense Analyses. Their conversation covers the increased alignment and cooperation between Russia and China and between Russia and North Korea, as seen through Vladimir Putin's recent visit to Pyongyang. They also discuss Russia's war in Ukraine, the risks of further escalation by Moscow, and how the West should respond.
While they are strategically autonomous actors, China and Russia can and do coordinate actions to make more trouble for the United States and the West. And I think it is worrying that North Korea's ambitions are being fueled, quite literally, by Russia, and North Korea is supporting Russia's war of brutal attrition in Ukraine.
They discuss the lessons Kim Jong-un is learning from Putin's war in Ukraine, whether UN sanctions against North Korea are an effective mechanism, and how else allies and partners can respond.
My view of the sanctions is that they can never be perfect, but I don't think that means the sanctions are no longer working and we don't need it anymore. I think we do need them.
This interview was recorded on the sidelines of the conference, so please forgive the slightly suboptimal audio quality, but we promise it's worth the extra bit of oral effort because it's a properly fascinating conversation.
Peter, thank you very much for joining the ASPI podcast today. And today we're going to be discussing some things which are already being talked about in the ASPI conference, Joining Forces, which is going on as we're recording this, picking up some of the themes of nuclear threats, and particularly looking at, I guess, the areas of the world that both of you have spent much of your career focusing on, Russia and North Korea, but maybe also considering wider dynamics around the Indo-Pacific. If I maybe start with you, Peter, because Russia's so much in the news at the moment. We've just recently had more nuclear threats from Putin. He's made several now, I think, since he began the invasion of Ukraine. I think most recently they've conducted some tactical nuclear weapon exercises in southern Russia. Paul Dibb was writing in The Strategist recently saying that he's actually quite new. He doesn't recall in his time them doing tactical exercises like that. This is obviously very worrying, but how much should we take this seriously? Is this a bluff by Putin?
I think it would be a mistake to dismiss it as bluff, but we also should not fall into the trap of self-deterring. There's probably a more scholastic and rigorous count, but I'm aware of more than 50 times since February 2022 that either President Putin or former President Medvedev or someone else representing the Kremlin's view has alluded to the use of nuclear weapons. And over the 2 years of Mr. Putin's war of choice in Ukraine, we have seen an escalation in the rhetoric around the existential nature, the civilizational nature of this war from the Kremlin's point of view. Now, in Russian doctrine, the use of nuclear weapons is foreseen in the event of an existential threat by whatever means to Russia, as judged by the Kremlin. So this is consistent with the line of rhetoric, but we have heard this before. The question that must inevitably flow from how risky is this is, well, what is the effect or the gain that is sought? But we should not, I think, believe that he will not resort to some sort of action because it is the Russian doctrine to escalate, to de-escalate, which is a little bizarre because escalatory measures are being practiced on a daily basis by Russia's armed forces, launching missiles into power stations, apartment blocks, hypermarkets, civilian points of infrastructure, wantonly and in breach of the laws of armed conflict. So escalation is not something we should necessarily be scared of in terms of any actions the collective West takes in response to Putin's rhetoric or war of choice.
Thanks. I think that is also something that Beck Shrimpton here at ASPI picks up in her recent report, where she does address escalate to de-escalate, which I think is sort of commonly associated with Russian doctrine, but I think does also exist, or at least should exist, in Western thinking as well. Bea, or perhaps moving a little bit more to you, the world is, of course, watching what's going on in Ukraine and these threats that Putin is using. Arguably, nuclear weapons are already affecting the war. Arguably, some Western restraint has been exercised because of the threat of Russian nuclear use. And arguably, perhaps Russia has been dissuaded from using nuclear weapons up till now because there is a credible threat of retaliation. But looking to the Indo-Pacific, what do you think the lessons are being learned by particularly Kim Jong-un in North Korea and maybe Xi Jinping in Beijing?
Right. I think number one thing is that both North Korea and China learned is the value of nuclear caution and the strategic need of their nuclear capabilities. And maybe if I talk in detail about North Korea, I think their lessons are being really learned from the Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and their threat to use tactical nukes. Because if we see North Korea's recent developments, they have been emphasizing their need to mass production of tactical nukes. They display their Hwasan-31 nuclear developments, which is partially bluff is one of the components of this Russia, China, North Korea in demonstrating the capabilities that they are building. So what North Korea is doing is by using their plan to develop tactical nukes, deploy them, and also training them on site, they're trying to raise their leverage by using their nuclear weapons. So that's a strategic basis. In more detail, as you know, the new nuclear law in 2022 in September, and one of the main observations that I made was the really intriguing resemblance between Soviet Union's dead-hand system, the perimeter system, which said that if there is attack by U.S., the Russia's pre-planned program will launch their ICBMs automatically.
Wow, sounds like Dr. Strangelove.
Yes. I mean, there are debates whether the Soviet Union really had it or not, but I think North Korea's nuclear law 2022, which emphasizes North Korea's commitment to preemptively and automatically use their nuclear weapons if their leadership is in attack. I think it's a really close resemblance, and I think this comes from North Korea's looking into Russia's use of nuclear weapons and their strategies.
Wow. So if North Korea is looking to Russia to understand nuclear doctrine, strategy, I mean, that's obviously happening at the same time as North Korea is supplying arms to Russia for use in Ukraine, I think ballistic missiles, as well as lots of small arms and ammunition. We had a meeting in the Russian Far East recently between Kim and Putin.
Yes.
And of course, Russia is itself probably regularly breaching UN Security Council sanctions, even though it was responsible for putting them in place. It's breaching them by supplying lots of raw materials and technology to North Korea. That relationship between Russia and North Korea, how significant and deep do you think that goes, and what does it mean, particularly for our region, the Indo-Pacific?
Well, 2 points. First, it proves that Ukraine is not a European sideshow. It is directly and indirectly relevant to our Indo-Pacific region. First, you have an architect and a guarantor of the system of international security, Russia, a permanent member of the Security Council, breaching the sanctions that it helped impose upon North Korea to pursue its agenda in Ukraine. So it is, in that level, a deeply concerning development. Furthermore, the veto by Russia over the renewal of the mandate of the UN panel of experts in relation to policing those sanctions is clearly linked to the war in Ukraine. It is a quid pro quo for North Korea. China acquiesced in that as well. And that, to me, illustrates the second point, that while they are strategically autonomous actors, China and Russia can and do coordinate actions to make more trouble for the United States and the West. And I think it is worrying that North Korea's ambitions are being fueled quite literally, by Russia, and North Korea is supporting Russia's war of brutal attrition in Ukraine. So that tells me that the reliance upon rules and international law that is co-guaranteed by Russia and China as permanent members of the Security Council is something we cannot take for granted. And that should matter to every country in our Indo-Pacific region, not because of some spurious trigger that it will serve for an invasion of Taiwan. I think President Xi Jinping has his own autonomous strategic calculus about if and when and under what conditions he may be prepared to do that. And what happens in Ukraine is not going to affect that calculus. But what happens in Ukraine, as we've seen with Russia's connivance with North Korea, is deeply unsettling for our region and for the world.
B, we've touched on China there. I'm thinking that Australia is, of course, one of the countries that's involved in enforcing those UN Security Council sanctions. There's been some recent incidents of near the Korean Peninsula where Australian Navy assets have been targeted by the Chinese military, the PLA. Most recently, I think an Australian Navy helicopter was attacked with flares, which could have created a very serious accident. Well, if you call it an accident, it could have killed the crew if had the helicopter crashed. What's your view on how sustainable the sanctions regime is? If Russia is working to undermine the expert panel that's necessary for its implementation, if Russia and China are necessary to sustain it at the Security Council, and at the same time as Russia is in flagrant violation of the sanctions, China seems to be also working to undermine them. What chance do we have of keeping pressure on North Korea?
Right. My view of the sanctions is that they can never be perfect. There have always been loopholes. The Russia, China, North Korea have been finding their ways throughout those sanctions. But I don't think that means the sanctions are no longer working and we don't need it anymore. I think we do need them. And as Peter already mentioned, no country should take it for granted for what it has done. So I think it's very important. And if I kind of go back to your earlier question about the implications of all this, I think Russia, North Korea, or China's increasing cooperation in this region have very significant repercussions in the Pacific countries, in the ways that countries like Australia, South Korea, Japan, all these countries in this region are emphasizing their need for self-reliance, need for more alliances, and more multilateralism, layers of cooperation. And I think that should not be in the benefit. They are not strategic wins for Russia, North Korea, nor China. South Korea, for instance, we have been trying to expand our relations with countries beyond the Korean Peninsula region. We have been working with the United States, and then under the name of Indo-Pacific Strategy and this so-called Global Pivotal State Vision, we are trying to horizontally expand the relation with not only Australia, United Nations Command countries, NATO, and of course, the trilateral South Korea, Japan, US, despite the historical complexities between South Korea and Japan. So the sanctions may not be working perfectly, but I think the layers of cooperation, layers of partnerships are working. And US has been, in my knowledge, have been promoting allies-based sanction mechanisms, independent sanctions, they do it, and also with allies partners. And so the UN-led sanctions may be there, and we should definitely work on it, but there are also new initiatives that we are doing on the sides.
Can I just add one point there too? I agree with the question now is how do you enforce the UN sanctions? Because it's not the sanctions that have been rescinded. It's simply the panel of experts mandate is not being renewed. And the price for Russian and Chinese acquiescence in that renewal was essentially the sunsetting of the sanctions. And that was something that the United States was not going to tolerate, and rightly so. The worry I have as well, and it's important for our region, is the blow this strikes to the concept of non-proliferation. Because the North Korean approach has been one of serial proliferation. With the connivance, as we know in the past, of the AQ Khan network in Pakistan, we know Iran is maintaining connections with North Korea. I'm not suggesting there is an axis of autocratic evil. It is not as structured and deliberate as that. But taken together, these things erode the non-proliferation regimen that is so vital for security in our Indo-Pacific region, and that is, I would suggest, of existential importance to countries like South Korea and Japan, because in the face of renewed and reinvigorated nuclear ambitions on the part of North Korea, then that, of course, will attract consequences from a policy perspective from South Korea, from Japan and others. So it is troubling, and the enforcement side of it, in my view, was never particularly rigorous. We gained a lot of insights into illegal transshipments and transfers, including with Chinese connivance, not necessarily by Beijing, but certainly enabled by aspects and elements of the Chinese system. And so the question now is what practical measures can be taken, because the rhetoric we always hear out of the Kremlin is that sanctions other than those imposed by the UN Security Council are illegal. Well, Russia has now just breached sanctions that it helped impose. So why any Kremlin apologists should see any validity in the Kremlin's shape-shifting narratives about the rule of law and the primacy of the UN Charter when they are confronted with these flagrant perversions and breaches is beyond me. So there are real implications practically and systemically and conceptually and doctrinally from this measure.
Well, there's lots to do there. That'll be a separate podcast, I think, to really get to the sanctions. So thank you. That's a useful clarification. And your point, I think, on is not necessarily to go down the whole axis of adversaries route in order to accept that there are implications for what North Korea is doing in places like the Middle East. I mean, I believe that North Korean armaments are being used by Iran's terrorist proxies across the region, including Hamas. But I do want to stay on the Korean Peninsula a little bit, if we can. And B, I was interested, you talked about self-reliance there. You also talked about new partnerships. Maybe we do the partnerships as the next question. But for now, let's stay on self-reliance. Many of the things that South Korea is doing in its defense posture seem to have some similarities with what other countries like Japan and Australia are doing. You're the expert, but I believe is it the three-axis system that was brought in by one of your white papers? If I'm understanding that correctly, it's to use conventional force to hold North Korean missile bases, nuclear facilities and leadership at risk, which is interesting because you were saying that a strike on the leadership would perhaps be one of the things that would automate a full response from North Korea. Now, of course, South Korea is a US ally and does get extended nuclear deterrence through the US, and there's efforts to strengthen that nuclear deterrence and engage in more consultation on how it operates. But just on the self-reliance point of view, can a conventionally armed country like South Korea or Australia ever deter a nuclear armed power like North Korea if we hypothetically take US extended deterrence off the table?
This is a personal view, but my understanding is nuclear powers cannot be deterred by conventionally only. I think that's why South Korea has been developing its conventional defense capabilities while trying to secure nuclear umbrella from the United States. And if I talk a little bit more about this current administration, as a kind of traditional set of equation, we have tried to work on the self-defense capabilities, as you mentioned, the three-axis system. And on the side, we really work hard on the alliance part, creating the nuclear consultative group, institutionalizing ROK-US mechanism on discussing US's nuclear and also conventional operation in Peninsula in case of North Korean contingency. And although there are, of course, more challenges we have to overcome, but one accomplishment that I think South Korea and US have worked on recently is developing this idea of conventional nuclear integration. They used the term during their nuclear consultative group joint statement. And what this
January that was quite recent.
Recent, yes. What this concept really signals is that for South Korea, we are trying to clarify South Korea's role within US's nuclear strategy. Before, it was not really much discussed, but by clarifying South Korea's role and discussion with the United States, although there are, of course, limits, two important developments are made. Number one, by clarifying your role, you are clarifying what US will do during the consultation. So our nuclear IQ of South Korea increases. And second, And that translates to increasing credibility of the extended deterrence issues. So I hope to see more of the developments. But as I mentioned, if I go back to the earlier point about how nuclear powers cannot be deterred by conventional only, I think this question always brings back to outside attention to South Korea's nuclear ambitions in the region. I think that's inevitable, and the voice has been always there. It's nothing new.
It was mentioned by Yoon before he took
Yes,
office.
and also many times before. But as far as I know, the security communities, not that they are naive or optimistic about what U.S. could do in times of contingency, but we think that rationally it's more cost-effective. And that's the essence of why we are looking into extended deterrence rather than going nuclear on our own. And of course, we do have public polls showing like 70% support for nuclear, but our public discourse have not looked into the actual costs of maintaining those nuclear facilities, where we're going to test them, and all the other consequences that follow. So I wanted to stress that point.
It's a very good point. I think we do get some excitable headlines in Australia saying a majority of South Koreans want nuclear weapons for themselves. And as I think you pointed out, it's probably a lot more nuanced than that.
Yes, and if I may add just one more thing, I didn't have a chance to say it during the panel, but South Korea's, or like other countries, we are resource constrained, and our population will be the most aged population by 2044. And our population below 20s just fell below the population of people in the 70s last year. So it's a very old population. So considering all that, the cost discussion have to come in if we are to think about this new path, which have not been happened.
Well, you can look at the announcement today that Australia will be getting non-citizen soldiers if you need to expand your defence forces. But perhaps just putting your Australia hat back on, Peter, rather than your Russia one. Obviously, Australia's strategic geography is slightly preferable perhaps to South Korea's. You'd have a sea-air gap and all these things that allowed Australia to have a high degree of self-reliance in conventional forces until arguably quite recently. There was always that top cover in nuclear. But what lessons do you think Australia should perhaps be drawing from what's going on in Northeast Asia, what countries like South Korea and Japan are doing with their forces, or is Australia already there?
I don't think we're already there, but I think we've certainly identified the trajectory that we need, and that is enhanced self-reliance, which is not to say autarky. Australia has never gone to war on its own. And I think the question being, could we deter a nuclear-armed hostile state absent extended US nuclear deterrence on our own? Of course not. Simply mass and scale and capability work against us. But the notion of collective deterrence, and of course for decades, we, South Korea, Japan, Singapore, Malaysia, Philippines, others have relied upon that global security framework rooted in international law and the observance of codes and norms and practices. That has been what has underpinned our security. Russia is now tearing away at that fabric, and it is setting examples that others will seek to emulate or at least exploit. So for Australia, I don't think we've misstepped. We are flat-footed. But then most countries have been caught flat-footed by the reality of what has happened in Ukraine, and that illustrates that war is inherently kinetic, as the Swedish defence minister said when we were talking recently. And what we're seeing in Ukraine is that war is sustained. Now, we don't have to get to war to be subject to coercion and threat and risk. But Australia can no longer rely on geography. We can no longer rely on warning time. And that is what underpins the Defence Strategic Review, the Defence Strategic Update that preceded it in July 2020, and now is manifest in the first National Defence Strategy and the Integrated Investment Program. So in that sense, I think we are very much aligned with countries like South Korea, recognising the need for greater self-reliance, but not assuming that the US will always be the decisive and the initial player. But it has to remain a core part of our separate but coordinated reactions to threats we face in the region. But I think we've seen ample illustration, including quite recently, of the growth in minilateral arrangements where countries are seeking to forge greater collaborative relationships, some of which will have normative value, some of which will be practical, some of which will be operationally focused. But that is part of how we respond to and build out, in my view, the scope of options available to us to signal commitment to acquiring and sustaining the capability we need for greater self-reliance in defence. And everything I've heard Bee say is consistent with that, albeit in South Korea, and having been to the DMZ myself, I'm very conscious of how much more proximate and existential those realities are for South Korea.
Well, you've read my mind, because our last question, I think we've only got a little bit of time left, will be about those minilaterals that you mentioned. But one suggestion for our listeners that Australia could learn from South Korea, I think, in preparing the Australian public for an understanding of extended deterrence would be South Korea, for example, recently hosted a ballistic missile submarine. So a submarine where you're confident it's got nuclear weapons on board. And a lot of them, Australia could consider it. There is a legal caveat in the Treaty of Rarotonga that would allow for it. It would focus minds here. And also in South Korea, when your leaders and your ministers at a 2+2 meeting with America, you will always have declaratory policy, I think, relevant to extended deterrence, perhaps even talking about nuclear weapons. And I don't think we do the same thing here in Australia. So the next AUKMIN, or perhaps when Anthony Albanese hopefully attends the NATO summit, there's an opportunity to explicitly talk about nuclear deterrence. Last question on those trilaterals. There's just been the Shangri-La dialogue in Singapore, and perhaps a new minilateral was born, the trilateral between Australia, South Korea and Japan, with the 3 defence ministers meeting. There wasn't a joint statement. I guess that's some way down the track. This becomes a regular format. But how significant is this particular partnership? This is the first instance I can think of in the security domain, at least, where you've got South Korea and Australia in the same minilateral format. They've engaged in multilateralism a lot, but it seems to be the first one that puts them together in the Venn diagram. So how significant is this? And I expect we've probably already had a response from the pulpit in Beijing from the press spokesperson, but does this play into China's propaganda around bloc politics, or should we not worry too much how China's going to react to this kind of thing?
Well, of course, I think this is a very significant development. I think we have been having discussions about involving, as far as in Korea, involving Australia in order to stimulate the trilateral relationship between US, South Korea, and Japan, especially in times of historical antagonism. If it's raised again, then people always ask, could inclusion of Australia and expanding the membership, could it facilitate more cooperation? So in that sense, I think this time without US, but Australia, South Korea and Japan, this is a new development, and it is very important for the stability of this Indo-Pacific region. And during the panels, I think some of the panelists talked about that the reason why these minilaterals are growing is not only because of the threat itself in the region, for instance, China, but also it's the kind of hedging against the uncertainties that arise from US's elections. So these 3 allies have common interests in dealing with those uncertainties together. So it's both threat-oriented, of course, and also it's industrial. I think it's not just security issues that are involved in this matter, so therefore it's very important. And the question about antagonizing China, I think, of course, it's inevitable that
They'll say that.
They will say that. But as far as South Korea goes, we have been trying to emphasize inclusiveness of our dealing with all those minilaterals. We try to not use China in the joint statements, at least some efforts to be more inclusive in the process. So it's inevitable that China would feel not happy about it. But I think that shouldn't stop us doing it, because I think it does send important signals to China that the coercive revisionist behaviors in the region actually stimulate more of these
pushback.
Getting together, which should not be to their benefit. And so it should make them more cautious. So
they are responsible effectively for the regional response they're receiving. Peter,
and just briefly to build on that parallel, the only reason President Putin faces an expanded NATO is because of what he has done.
Yes.
He would not have a 1,300-kilometre enlarged common border via Finland with NATO had he not indulge in his revisionist fantasy of recovering a past imperial glory. So it is unsurprising that Beijing is unhappy, but we are transparent.
Yeah.
The same cannot be said for Beijing. The notion that alliances or partnerships are only ever conceived of and implemented against someone is unique to Beijing and Moscow. There is this inability to comprehend that common histories, shared values, common systems lead countries to collaborate and cooperate. And as I've said already, not all of these arrangements have an explicit military dimension. Some are normative, some are about improving understanding of how we cooperate so that we can enhance our ability to work together. And very often that ability to operate jointly has been directed in support of humanitarian assistance and disaster relief activities. So an utterly benign application of something which may have a military or a security core. So we should not be bluffed and we should not self-deter because Beijing makes a sad face if South Korea, Japan and Australia coordinate and cooperate in the maritime or any other domain. And I think it is entirely natural, and it speaks to the evolving concern that people have about the corrosion of order and stability, and actions that are taken in Moscow and Beijing that have these consequences are actions for which Moscow and Beijing are responsible.
No, I agree wholeheartedly, and I think it echoes what we heard from Deputy Prime Minister Miles here at the ASPI conference earlier today, where he was talking about how utterly foundational, I think his term was, the rules-based international order is, and just because some people don't like us talking about it doesn't mean we shouldn't be talking about it. So thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome.
That's all we have for you this week on Stop the World. If you have any feedback on the podcast, we'd love to hear from you at podcast@aspi.org.au.
And be sure to follow us wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.